Just checking the mic. All right. All right. Welcome, everyone. Hun Becher hatten. Bari Galust. Welcome to Zahra Institute's annual lecture. We are delighted to be able to offer it in person this year and are grateful to the University of Chicago's Institute for the Study of Ancient Cultures for the use of this beautiful space. I am Ibrahim Demir, Executive Director at Zahra Institute. The Institute is a non-profit educational initiative with a focus on Kurdish studies. We have in the past offered summer schools focusing on Kurdish language, literature, and society. We collaborate with other institutions of higher education and mentor graduate students and international scholars. In 2021, we began to offer a Kurdish Studies certificate program, the first of its kind, in the United States. Today, I am thrilled to announce that we are launching an online Kurdish Studies MA program this fall. Stay tuned for further details. So now I will leave the introduction of our distinguished guest to Professor Bilici. Mücahit Bilici is Associate Professor of Sociology at John Jay College, City University of New York, and Director of Academic Affairs at Zahra Institute. Finally, I want to remind you that we have a reception after the talk with Kurdish-themed hors d'oeuvres served by the famous Chicago Kurdish restaurant, the Gundis. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Ibrahim, and welcome all. It's my pleasure to introduce our speaker today at Zahra Institute's annual lecture. Fatma Müge Göçek holds a PhD from Princeton University and has been teaching at the University of Michigan ever since. She has educated many cohorts of graduate students. I'm one of them. I remember when I came to Ann Arbor, she kindly opened her home to me until I found an apartment on Golden Avenue. Looking at her resume, you see that she is no doubt a hardworking and impressively prolific scholar. But as a mentor, she is on another level entirely. Her love, care, and compassion towards all her students, but particularly those from disadvantaged minority backgrounds, is simply unmatched. Her labor of care and guidance pays testimony to the true meaning of diversity. She has touched many lives. As for her students, and we are Kurdish, Armenian, Turkish, African American, various other internationals, we are forever in her debt. I want to take this opportunity to express my personal gratitude to Fatma Müge Göçek. Müge, you are an exemplary mentor. May the force of good be with you. Thank you. Now a few words about her research and publications. Müge Göçek is a historical sociologist who increasingly thinks comparatively. She approaches her material from a critical Du Boisian perspective. Her sole-authored works include East Encounters West, France and the Ottoman Empire in the 18th century, Rise of the Bourgeoisie, Demise of Empire, Ottoman Westernization and Social Change, The Transformation of Turkey, Redefining State and Society from the Ottoman Empire to the Modern Era, and more recently, Denial of Violence, Ottoman Past, Turkish Present, and the Collective Violence Against Armenians, 1789 to 2009. Professor Göçek also has published many edited and co-edited volumes. For the sake of brevity, I will mention only some of them. Reconstructing Gender in the Middle East came out in 1994, co-edited with Shiva Balagi. A Question of Genocide, Armenians and Turks at the End of the Ottoman Empire was co-edited with Ran Suni and Norman Naimark. Contested Spaces in Contemporary Turkey, Environmental, Urban, and Secular Politics was another work. Cultural Violence and Destruction of Human Communities, New Theoretical Perspectives was co-edited with Fiona Greenland. And just in the last year, she came out with 3 new books. The first of which is The Handbook of Sociology and the Middle East. It was co-edited with Gamze Evcimen, and I'm among the proud contributors. Another work, Kurds in Dark Times, New Perspectives on Race, Ethnicity, Violence and Resistance. It was co-edited with Ayça Alemdaroğlu, came out of Syracuse University Press. And finally, Critical Approaches to Genocide, History, Aesthetics and Politics, co-edited with Hülya Adak and Ran Suni. Having heard all this, you would surely agree that there could be no better speaker on today's topic. The title of her presentation is Kurds and Armenians in Comparative Perspective, from Ottoman Empire to the Modern Era. Professor Göçek is going to speak for around 40 minutes, and we will do the necessary precautions to let her know about the time. And then there will be 20 minutes of question and comments. After the lecture and discussion, we have a small surprise for you, courtesy of Professor Mark Gavur of North Park University. And we'll say more about that later. Müge Hocam, the floor is yours. Please help me welcome Professor Göçek.
Well, thank you so much. After that amazing discussion, who knows what I will deliver, but it doesn't matter, does it? I'll get my paper out and start by thanking, of course, Zahra Institute for giving me this opportunity, at least to get a sense of coming back after COVID. We're slowly making our way to appear in person as well. So it's a great opportunity for me as well to be able to talk for the first time in a long time. And of course, it's very hard when you work on these things, on these issues, to be all by yourself for a very long time, which we had to be in COVID. But now we're back in action, so to speak. So it's wonderful to be here. I also want to thank my former graduate student, now friend and colleague, Mücahit Bilici, for giving me this opportunity. I want to actually shape the talk around literally how this talk came to being, because it will give you a sense of how we construct narratives. Since I am using the critical Du Boisian perspective, I think I would also bring my personality or my standpoint in to give a sense of how these things work. Because I think in critical work, the only accountability we have is through transparency. And that is why I want to share my thoughts with you, so that you could see why I think the things I do and how I arrived at them. So usually, Mücahit, being a wonderful friend and colleague, occasionally calls me to see, to celebrate the holidays or, Bayram or something else. And then we talk about what is he doing, what am I doing. So I was telling that after writing The Denial of Violence against, of course, denial of violence against the Armenians, which was sort of my most recent sole-authored work. What I did there was I didn't understand basically, as a sociologist, you can see why states deny certain violence in their past, because states have no hearts, as we know, and they do realpolitik. What I couldn't understand was, why did Turkish society go along with it? I mean, and that is why I wanted to see how that collective violence against the Armenians emerged in the Ottoman Empire, and then continued. And I started in 1789, which is, of course, the year of the French Revolution, but more importantly, for us at least, it was the coming to power of Selim III. So it meant sort of the emergence of systemic westernization in the Ottoman Empire then. And I argue that because of, you know, in the critical perspective, post-colonial perspective, it is basically, if you think about Western European modernity and the problems with it, I think polarized society. That was at least what I sort of demonstrated. And I looked at the way Armenians were treated first as subjects during the imperial era, 1789 to 1907. And there, of course, sort of Armenian massacres emerged in 1894 to 96 as sort of an indication of the polarization that goes on. Then the second era is the Young Turk period, 1908 to 1918. There, of course, you have the Armenian genocide. And after that, I have two Republican periods. One of it goes until from 1918 to 1974, 73. So you get a sense that I go along with Erik Jan Zürker's formulation and see the continuity of the Ottoman state tradition into the Turkish Republic and treat it as one continuum. And I would argue it's still continuing to this day, at least that unionist tradition, at least in the form of what is called in Turkey the deep state. But I'll talk about that later. I finished in 73 because in 74, and during that time, the Istanbul trials were very important in sort of dismissing, Turkish nationalists dismissing the Armenian question. And of course, 74 is the assassination of Turkish diplomats that start 74 to 86. And I brought it all the way to 2009. And there, of course, I end with another assassination, 2007 assassination of Hrant Dink. And that is how the book was formulated. After that, when I was working on this, what was very important for me was that I used memoirs. I didn't use government documents because they, of course, they're not objective. They are inherently nationalist in the sense that they look after the interests of the nation state itself and the republic rather than interests of the citizens or the subjects as they were before. And the memoirs turned out to be mostly memoirs of officers and officials, Turkish officers and officers, because these were memoirs written in Turkey in Turkish. All memoirs printed in the Turkish script from 1928 onwards. I basically looked at all of them and chose the ones that had to do with the violence against minorities, and that is how I, worked on the book. But what was very interesting, these were mostly officers and officials that literally participated in the genocide one way or the other. And it is there that I could see how this othering and nationalism came together, this virulent nationalism, racist rationalism, that came into being, I think emerged as these people justified the violence that they demonstrated against the Armenians. What was very interesting for me then was how, since I was looking at the violence against other groups, obviously there were the Greeks, but they already had the Greek independence, so that was pretty much in the 1820s or 30s. They sort of were settled and they were no longer the dominant milleti sadıka. The loyal nation was, of course, the Armenians. And then there were also the Jews, but they were much smaller. And unlike the Armenians, they didn't have Asia Minor as their ancestral lands. And it was while working on the Armenian genocide, and especially the Republican period, I realized that in the memoirs there was a shift from Armenians to Kurds as the other of the Republic. And therefore, I said, well, that's very interesting. I mean, we do know there is a lot of continuity. Many of the officials and officers who were engaged in the genocide then went and were very important, Şükrü Kaya, for example, being one. Of course, İsmet İnönü and others, Celal Bayar and such, who were all members of the Teşkilat-ı Mahsusa, the special organization, and they were very important among the Unionists in actually then going and putting down the Kurds after doing a survey, an ethnic survey of Anatolia, Ziya Gökalp being included in them. But that is because of the special stage of nationalism at the time was a cultural nationalism. That's why he was in there. Then, of course, it became virulent an ethnic nationalism. But I therefore realized that after the destruction of the Armenians, it was the violence then started to develop against the Kurds. And therefore, since my first volume was called Denial of Violence, I thought the second one I would call, the one I'm working on, Denial of Identity, because obviously violence showed itself not only in physical destruction, even though that was also a part of the Kurdish experience in Turkey, unfortunately, but in addition to that, there was also symbolic cultural destruction at the same time. That is much more significant than the Armenian case. So that is why I decided to write a book, and I said that it is interesting because when you look at the Kurds as such, obviously, one thing I learned from studying the Armenian genocide is that those who died were persecuted and massacred were the lucky ones, so to speak, because I became aware of how those who remained, the remnants of the sword, as they say, as well as generations, you know, as I was talking to many Armenians, you know, here, I could see, they said, we do not want to pass this hatred, this mourning onto our children. We have to come, you know, to terms. And of course, for that to happen, there has to be acknowledgement. Denial, as you know, is the last stage of genocide. I mean, and in a way, therefore, in that context, I said those who remain suffer so much. And of course, by the time the Kurds sort of, because of their position, and I will talk about that later, they weren't destroyed through a genocide. But when I went, and for 5 summers I visited Armenia, former Western Armenia, and today's Bakur, Kurdistan, there when I talked to Kurds living there, they said, yes, our grandparents told us that the Armenians, when they were leaving, said, we were breakfast and you're going to be lunch to the Turks. And indeed, it looks like there were indeed, Armenians were intermediaries almost, and once the Armenians were taken out, the Kurds became the other. So there is this continuity, but the violence there isn't only violence of the body, even though, of course, if you think about the imprisonment, the self-immolations, of prisoners literally lighting themselves up in fire. There is that, and tortures. There is definitely that aspect, but I use the more Native American or Asian body, mind, spirit trilogy. And in addition to body, I also looked at how mind, their mental sort of state, was also destroyed, or they tried to destroy them, especially by removing them forcibly from their villages and others outside, especially with the 5,000 villages that happened, as you probably know, by the Turkish military that were evacuated. And later on, there is this constant sense, and it starts from the 1830s onwards, this sort of exiling Kurds away from their source of power within Turkey. So that, of course, mentally doesn't enable you to think of your community as attached to a homeland, and that is very important. And there is the sense of spirit. Spirit is sort of belonging to this community, and there, the fact that, especially in the 80s onward, they weren't allowed to speak their language in public spaces, or have an education in their own language, or to be claimed that they were actually mountain Turks, which is utterly ridiculous, gives you a sense of how spiritually there's also violence. So that is the theme of the next book, and I'm going to be writing it together with a former student, but now colleague of mine, Adnan Çelik, who is actually was at the École and graduated from there. And he conducted 60 interviews along these 3 themes, very long interviews, and that's what we're working on to put that into a book. That is the second volume, but what happened was that because COVID came and I couldn't sort of, continue interacting, collecting information from Turkey, I also started a third project. What I want to do is, the third one is called Denial of Experience. And what I'm going to do is that I'm going to use my minority sort of model, analysis, sociological analysis that I developed with the Kurds and Armenians in Turkey. I'm going to apply them to natives and blacks in the United States, because I want to be able to see the foundational violence and how they work, but from the vantage point of someone who comes from out of society and who has studied minorities from another perspective. And that's what the Du Boisian sort of, perspective comes in, because it will be based, the third one will be called Denial of Experience. And denying, of course, experience of both natives and blacks at the expense of the white majority, the white hegemonic majority that basically set this system up, and still to this day continues in the same system. So that third one, now we're in the second and the third one, sort of in between the two. And this was what I was initially going to tell you, and then it was going to be done. But I still have time left, and things got out of hand. Why did things get out of hand? Because of what has been happening in Turkey in the last couple of weeks. The election process was extremely aggravating for me to watch, especially after I said I was going to do this, and I was going to say, see, this is what I did, and I was just going to tell you the similarities, differences, and leave it at that. But no, what I was very struck with, especially in terms of how President Erdogan, in a way, executed his speeches. I have never seen publicly unsanctioned racism against the Kurds to that degree. What was, to me, very sad was not that he's capable of it. Unfortunately, we know he's capable of much more in terms of morality. It is fascinating that someone who thinks highly of religion ends up weaponizing religion and using it literally for his own ends to such a degree. And then to literally, virulently attack the Kurds, as if, I mean, it was the whole election seems to be, in a way, working around Kurds and where do they fit? Should they be a part of the Turkish body politics after 100 years? Should they not be? And obviously, at the moment, one can see that President Erdogan has come together with the deep state that is made of officers and officials, mostly retired within the state and government together, that ultimately are also very nationalistic in spirit. And deep state, after the end of the Russia, of the Soviet Union in 1989-91, divided into two branches. One is the NATO branch, that is pro-Western. The other one is they call it the Avrasya, Eurasian branch, and that is very much in line with Russia and India and such. So those are sort of, and what we're seeing is those two going at each other. And what is interesting is, of course, both of them have a nationalist tendency. And that is why I want to reflect here not only on the Kurds and Armenians, who are, of course, who both consider Asia Minor their ancestral lands, different parts of it, but nevertheless, they were there before the Turks, who came in 1071 officially with the Battle of Manzikert and onwards. But I decided to triangulate it because one thing that makes both Armenians initially a minority as a millet system is, of course, the Ottoman state. And even though Kurds at the beginning of the Turkish Republic were one of the two foundational elements that literally fought against the Greeks and the Armenians and others to establish the republic, they were shortchanged. So that they, I think, even though they are on their own ancestral lands, they have become minorities on their own lands because of the way of the sort of Turkish political system. And that is how, what happens is that when you bring the Turks in, you realize how these two groups were minoritized at different times, at different periods, and how there is a continuity also from one to the other. The most significant continuity towards both of them, and this is one reason why we still have so much instability and violence in Turkey and no democracy, is that both of them share one element in common. They both have violence against them for which no Turkish person has been held accountable. So unaccountable violence is what unites the experience of the two and what sort of makes them minority. And that is why we have to bring in the virulent Turkish nationalist element, because that has never been held accountable for all the basically violence that they meted out, first through the Union and Progress to the Armenians, and later through the remnants of Union and Progress, who then became the leaders of the Turkish Republic, to the Kurds. And that is the continuity that I'm talking about, the comparative continuity. So that is the major points that I'll be making, and what my argument is there is that the comparative analysis and Kurds and Armenians in relation to the Turks, and that's what I'm adding, that's the post-colonial sort of Du Boisian move based on their experiences of Armenians and Kurds, the formation and transformation of systemic Turkish racism under the guise of Turkish nationalism. And this is, I think, what's now being worked out in Turkey, because nationalism as a negative force, as an exclusionary force, has not been discussed at all in Turkey in the case, and it is so normalized and naturalized that the violence that nationalism leads to, especially in the Eurasian version of things, has not been accounted for to this day. And that is how we can tell there is no democracy in Turkey. And I argue that the only time there was democracy in Turkey was between 1920 and 1922. Do you know what I'm referring to? It's the First National Assembly. The First National Assembly had 25% of that assembly was Kurds, of Kurdish people of Kurdish origin, who were also sent from those regions to represent and, of course, bring into, therefore, the discussion, the issues and the problems that were happening. What happened then, of course, with the Second Assembly in 1923, all of them were excluded, and all of the assembly members were directly appointed from Ankara, who had nothing to do with those regions that they came from. And that system has continued to this day, with somehow some democratization when we go into the multi-party system. But then again, at that point, you have also the creation of a group of sort of state Kurds, so to speak, Turkish state Kurds and others. So that division that starts early with the Hamidiye, regiments, then continues and becomes institutionalized, obviously, in sort of these Kurdish representatives, but seen as the other, so to speak, initially. And after, of course, the multi-party rule, the Kurds that are elected, if I was making a list of how many Kurdish parties they were established from 1990s onwards, and how many of them were closed, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, we're on the 10th one. I mean, from 1990 to this day, we're talking 33 years. That's sort of how much they have trying to be a part of the body politic and are not. And to this day, we go into an election, where the Selahattin Demirtas is in jail, even though Erdogan says we have democracy and democratic elections, which obviously is a figment of his imagination, with him in jail. The other person who is in jail is Osman Kavala, who is my classmate from high school, actually. And he, I think, is there because after the Armenians and the Kurds, I think the next target of both the deep state, especially the Eurasian version, of course, are the secular Turks, secular white Turks, secular liberal white Turks. And who represents them better than Osman Kavala, because of his philanthropy and everything. He is the secular alternative, I would argue, to Erdogan, and that is why he's in jail. And then, of course, Demirtas is in jail because they do not want Kurds to be a part of the body politic of Turkey, truly democratic body politic. But what I want to do, I'm going ahead of my time, what I wanted to do is to give you a sense of why I'm thinking what I'm thinking, and so that you could see how I came to this. And I'm basing this on my experience with dealing with the Armenian genocide, because I'm going to argue eventually with the second book, once I start talking on the Kurds, that what happened against the Kurds was also genocidal. I mean, so that is what lies in wait for the Turkish state and society, at least until they get what's going on. I want to continue on that vein. And for that, of course, it's important to look at state and society, and to also demonstrate to you my line of thinking, because whenever I gave talks, and I gave a number of them at the University of Chicago too, it turns out the Consul General called them, the students, the night before and said they should come and they should protest my talk. Undergrads, being smart, said, well, yeah, but what's she talking about? What are we going to protest? They said, okay, we'll go and listen and then we'll decide. Well, they came and listened, and afterwards they stayed for the cocktail, and that's when they told me and others about this. And the Consul General also at the time had called Fred Donner, who was heading the Middle East Center, and said, there's a lot of upset among the Turkish community in Chicago about her coming. And she said, Fred is an old friend. Fred said, well, she's a very esteemed colleague of mine. If you want to come and talk about your views, we can have a series for state administrators coming through, and you can do it there, rather than trying to undermine and take over my space, obviously, academic space. So that is why whenever I give talks, I have these people coming and they say, you are ignorant. I'm saying, yes. And what are you basing this on? They say, well, I read a book once. I said, and what was the book? They can't remember the title. Somebody says, I read a journal article, or I read it in the newspaper. And I'm saying, you know, the chutzpah, for them, you know, I read about 300 memoirs, 500 books, thousands of articles, and then I am there, and they have the wherewithal. I mean, and that is what this virulent sort of ideological stance do to you, the politicization and the weaponization. They take me on, and because of that, though, I have lots of war scars, but I'm going to use all of those now on my next stage when I do take on the Kurdish issue, and then to take on the Native American and Black issue. So in a way, you can see how they all sort of add up together. But that's why I sort of am very careful about documenting everything as well. So why do I sort of, then after putting these in terms of my own research, I started looking, because I'm a comparative historical sociologist, of how Kurds and Armenians and the relations between them developed. Why? Because if you think about and see Kurds and Armenians, what Turkish nationalism has willfully done is to hit them against each other. Not only that, but they also, of course, weaponized the Kurds against the Armenians during the genocide, too. Although there were also some some Kurds who helped the Armenians. So it's both ways. But if you think about it, Armenians mostly know only about those Kurds who killed them. Or went after their families. And that is also what the Turkish state highlights at the expense of those who helped them. Because what they do not want is all these minorities to come together. And because if those minorities come together, that would be the basis, foundations of democracy in the Turkish Republic, established for the first time. And that is the pain, the birthing pain of that democracy, if it ever takes place, that we're seeing with this election, is what I would argue. So from that vantage point, rather than having the two in this stigmatized way as to who did how much violence against whom, and who wins, if there is a winner, there unfortunately isn't. It's the Turkish state that wins ultimately. What's important is for them to, so I'm going to share with you a social scientific analysis very briefly, because I don't have much time left. It's okay? Okay. But I basically look at the points of intersection. When you look at the origins of both the Kurds and Armenians, these are both the ancestral, of course, people of Asia Minor. Turks, of course, come much later. And if you look at, so I didn't pay much attention to the history of Armenians and Kurds before the Turks came, because that's when things start getting difficult. So I start with 1071 onwards. But if you look at then, you see that Armenians have held and formed many principalities, kingdoms, and everything much earlier. They are sort of seen as the first Christians, at least they see themselves as the first community to Christianize in the Middle East. And then you see the Kurds becoming dominant, or at least establishing principalities in the AD, Anno Domini, in the Common Era, as opposed to the before the Common Era, where the Armenians seem to be. But what's important is that their sort of highlights, cultural, political, and other highlights have appeared earlier, very similar to the Ottoman Empire being a pre-modern empire. I mean, they too were there earlier, and therefore, even though they are both from the region, they are much more, they first are under Byzantine rule, and then, of course, with the Seljukids and the coming into Asia Minor in 1071 after the Battle of Manzikert, then you see the emergence there of the various Selçukid state, the Ottoman principality, and then, of course, the Ottomans take on. And what's very interesting in it is, of course, the religious difference. One is, as I said, Christian. The other one, Kurds are mostly Muslim. But within that, they are also, there are the Alevi, the Shafi, and there are many different ones. They're much more heterodox rather than sort of Orthodox Sunni thing that I come from. I also want to bring in my own history into this. And you would ask why? Because it is important for transparency in a Du Boisian term to say, who am I then? And why did this become an issue? I am an ethnic Turk. I'm a white Turk. When I came and started talking about these issues, Armenians would come to me after my talk and they would say, you must have some Armenian blood in you. And they would say, you do, because you say civilized things, and no Turk could say such civilized things. Obviously, your blood became civilized with Armenian blood. And I would say, not to my knowledge, I don't think I have any Armenian blood. I mean, and I don't mind it one way or the other. And we know so many politicians in Turkey, especially virulently nationalist politicians who are actually of Armenian origin, but we won't go there. We don't want it banned that much, right? I mean, so what we do is, but the Turks would come to me afterwards as well, and they would say, you cannot be a Turk. And I'd say, no, I think I am. And then they would say, no, no Turk in his, of course, not her, probably, in their right mind would say what you're saying. You obviously have something mixed up there that tainted your blood with Armenian blood. See, in that case, it's the tainting, not the civilizing. But what's fascinating is both sides are saying exactly the same thing. They're excluding me in a similar way. I mean, so what I'm waiting with bated breath is to see if I'm now going to be said to be a Kurd, because I was said to be an Armenian. But what I did was I went actually, I looked at my whole family tree, I did the Ancestry.com, and I also went to one suspect place was Agan in Erzincan, where I'm from. Originally, one part of my family is from there. I went there to see. The others are, we know from sort of the north, they came down, and then some were already in Istanbul, and then there were, this was the suspect one in the east. That could technically be Armenian or Kurdish, if there is any origin. We were very excited. There is this little town called Başpınar in Elazığ, near Ain, that I went to. Years after my great-grandfather had left that village to take his kids to Istanbul for their education, because he thought that was where the future would be, even though he was there. So in the end, what happened was that once, of course, if you think about the thing, my mother said, oh, we're maybe Armenian. My uncle says, no, maybe we're Kurds. They were like all excited. I'm on the phone, we're going up, whatever. I met with the imam there. Interestingly enough, I saw the house that my grandfather was born in, great-grandfather, the school he went to, the many fountains. He was the sheikh, not the of the place, and he married the of another place. So we were all there. Our history is written by the victors. This village used to be called Başvartenik, meaning the rose bush in Armenian. So I said, what happened to the Armenians here? They said, oh no, I mean, very early on, it turns out my ancestry goes back to the 11th, 12th century to the Caucasus. And there we move on to the Ottoman Empire in the 15th century, 16th century, as a Turkoman tribe. And we are settled there because we are Sunnis, and when the Ottomans then go on conquests to the east, it's like we are the guards and sort of to make sure and provisioning the army, I guess that was. So that was the story. So I come back, I said, go figure. I'm more Turkish than all of them put together, right? So next talk I'm saying, no, I checked. I am Turkish. And then they say, well, you never know. It may have gotten mixed somewhere somehow. I mean, of course, then you realize this is a way of thinking you do not know. So let me just sort of, in contextualizing sort of how at least I negotiate these differences and similarities, very briefly look at, so there was in 1071 Manzikert. I looked at what were the experiences that Kurds and Armenians had together. And then if you look at it, there is in 1639 the famous Kastri-Shirin agreement. The treaty is extremely important because that was when both Kurdistan and Armenia were divided between the Ottoman and Persian empires. And that is when you got the East and West Armenia divided. You also got, of course, the Kurds divided between the two empires, not only two, later on, with the nation-state formation, the four. So there is definitely a similar experience as these ancestral people, basically, who lived together for a long time, were also treated. If you look at it, I would argue that both of them suffered violence from 1789 on, because of Ottoman westernization and the transition from subjecthood to citizenship. That is when sort of nationalism comes, ethnic nationalism sort of takes over, and there you see a very interesting sort of play of both religion on the one side and race on the other. In the sense, against Armenians, of course, religion is used as a way, because in the Ottoman system, the Muslims are the millet-i hakime, the dominant ones, and then, therefore, the others are all sort of second place. But later on, after the destruction of the Armenians and the elimination of other sort of traditional religious minorities, what you get later on in the Turkish Republic, of course, is then the use of race. First of all, through co-optation, they claim all Kurds are Turks. Kurdish is like Turkish. I tell you, I now know 8 languages. Kurdish is nowhere near Turkish. One is Ura-Altaic, the other one is Indo-European. They are totally different. But nevertheless, what is important is that they too start basically facing this. Of course, Armenians, because of their religion and their connection to the West, and Kurds, because of their connection to the region, obviously, and their participation in the War of Independence, and also in also the Armenian genocide, under the mistaken impression that they were, with 25% of their basically members in the Turkish National Assembly, they thought they were two of the founding nations of Turkey, the Turkish Republic. And that is when, of course, the major bad thing happens with that much later. When you look at the Sykes-Picot Agreement of 1916, 1920 Sèvres Agreement, and 1923, that is when Kurdish and Armenian state formation sort of comes into being. So that is a very important turning point. It's one, of course, concocted by the West in terms of sort of the nation-state image. And then when 1923 comes by, Armenians are there as a recognized minority, especially the Lausanne Treaty is very important, and they're having a very interesting conference on it at Northwestern. You should follow it coming this weekend. And then the Kurds, were promised on 16th, 17th January 1923, Mustafa Kemal, later Atatürk, at the Izmit meeting he said he promised local sovereignty to the Kurds. And he said, mahalli muhtariyet or yerel özerklik is how you would sort of translate it today. I mean, so we are talking about local sovereignty. When do they go back against this? At the Lausanne, basically. And they do not on purpose they say, Kurds are a noble race like us. We founded this republic together. Therefore, they cannot be considered a minority, they say. And then once half of the Kurds, of course, go along with it, some of them do not, but they don't have a say. And basically, in the end, that is how, if I may, how they basically get shortchanged. And in the end, that promise and reneging on that promise means that most of the conflict happens with the Kurds from 1925 onwards, one rebellion after another, because this is not the deal they wanted. And to this day, because of Turkish nationalism and the way it has been weaponized by Turkish state, unfortunately, they are still not, there's every attempt to stop them from being a part of Turkish society, or society in Turkey, let's say. It's not right to call it Turkish society either. We say Türkiye'li, but we can't say that in English. We have to find a way to talk about that. But nevertheless, most of the major difference between the two are Armenians suffered much more, of course, the destruction at the late Ottoman period with the proto-nationalist Ittihad and Terakki, the Unionists, which then translated into what we see in the Turkish Republic today, the violence against the Kurds once they were eliminated, literally after being promised to be a foundational member of the Republic. And they have been fighting since then. And to add insult to injury, all the violence that the Turkish state points to is violence as if it were started by the Kurds for reasons best known to themselves, because they're violent in nature. So there's this incredible projection against Armenian violence in the first place and Kurdish violence in the next, totally, therefore, making and obfuscating Turkish state violence, which is behind it all. A state violence that is based on a version of Turkish nationalism which needs to get eliminated for there to be a truly democratic Turkey going forward. And that's what I would like to see. Whether I'll see it or not, we do not know. And I stop there. Thank you.
Thank you, Müge Hocam. Now we can have questions and any comments.
Sure.
There should be a microphone. One of our friends should be. Yeah, okay. So, would you like to see it?
I don't need
Any questions?
They're stunned. Yeah, go ahead.
You mentioned that the...
Yes. Yeah, sure.
Oh, sorry. I don't need that. You mentioned that you based your book a lot on memoirs in order to avoid taking just the government narrative. But I'm wondering what those memoirs, like who was writing these memoirs? Was it mostly people who, if not in the government, were sort of associated with the ruling elites, or is it really memoirs of the common men and women?
Well, they weren't the common men and women. These were mostly national elites. But you did, at the very beginning, though, there were some memoirs by Greeks and Armenians. I only took them if they were written in Turkey in Turkish, because I wanted to say that Turkish society was what I was interested in. The Turkish state, I told you how they make their minds, but strategically, but the Turkish society, in order to see what they thought, I literally started what was available in print in Turkey for them to see if they were to change their minds, and they didn't. So I looked from 1928 onwards, and I did a search because I'm obsessive that way. I literally collected all the memoirs that were written in Turkey in Turkish, read through them. There were about 700-800 of them, and then made a list of all the ones. So that was my criteria, that it was written in Turkey in Turkish. But you're right, it so happened that most of them were perpetrators, as you can imagine. Although most recently, from the 1980s onwards, after especially the fall of the Soviet Union, you start seeing some others come in. You started, for example, what's very interesting, of course, is the Turkish state also uses the alphabet change from Arabic script to Latin script very politically. So they only translated and printed, unionist accounts, not the opponents. The opponents sort of started coming, much more the religious ones, after the fall of the Soviet Union. You started getting then those and Armenian ones. But I literally looked at all the ones that were published until 2009, so that hopefully that was representative enough. That's how it was. Thank you for that question.
Any other questions?
Yes.
Gentleman over there. Let's use the microphone so we can take over.
Thank you very much, first of all. So you mentioned that also Kurds have been part of the genocide. They have been accounted all over the Armenians. Where was the religion stance in these terms? Was it really Kurds who have been part of the regiments, like Hamidiya regiments, or part of the state at that time period? Or was there religious personnel that who actually took on by themselves, took arms, and then acted on the atrocities that have happened?
That is a very interesting question, and that is where you get, that reminds me of, which part of a camel do you touch gives you a whole different sort of image of where things were. Empires as such were made of very different contingencies. And if you look at Asia Minor itself, Anatolia, and different Kurdish tribes made different arrangements with either the Persians or the Ottomans, and that also changed from one generation to another. So it is hard to know. We know that they recruited ones, especially ones that were not as prominent, with the Hamidiye alayları. So that is when the sort of course, Kurds are a part of the Muslim Millet-i Hakime. That is why they can carry arms. And if you carry arms, you are able to then, especially after 1863, which was when private property was recognized in the Ottoman Empire, that is when the sedentarization of the Kurds started to take place. And that is also when they started having conflicts with the Armenians, because there was no title deed, and a lot of Armenians lost the lands they were working on because they didn't have the deeds. So as a consequence, I think it is those sort of unsettled Kurdish tribes that were very much supported by the Ottoman government. And so it's very hard to know who exactly did what at what point because there is so much variation. This is also a problem that emerged with the Armenian genocide because there are some parts where they sent them right to be destroyed, for example, in Diyarbakir, Antep, Marash, in those regions. There were others where it was harder, and there was a lot of resistance, usually in the West. And then there were others who resisted, and then the governors were changed. And so because of that, also some get massacred, others are not. You do not get massacred, and that is why you have so many variations there. But what's important is the politicization of this, and you cannot then say, oh, X people did this, that means they're all violent. No, they're not. It's not a black and white picture. Nothing is black and white. When you make something black and white, that's the Western European modernity way of thinking. You are either with us or against us, and that is what polarizes society. And once you see the nuances, only then can you live democratically, because then the violence or the peace is shared by the community equally, I would argue. Thank you. Yes, you want?
Yes, thank you. Very enlightening talk. I'm Michael Fry. I'm African American, and you mentioned earlier that the genocide, the Armenian genocide, and the Kurdish genocide that's ongoing. That the physical violence was of course extremely harmful, but that those that survived, right, and especially in the climate of denial, that the mental, emotional, and social emotional damage that occurs. And my partner and I, she's Armenian, I'm African American, we've been together for over 10 years, and we often talk about the...
Yes, there we go. This one is for you.
Thank you.
This conference, yes.
Thank you. And we
true audience, you're the true audience, yes.
Thank you. And we often talk about the similarities between, genocide and what we would call our genocide here, which is slavery.
Yes.
And currently the kind of ban on anti-racist education, which would be informing the entire populace of not his story or the story of the winner in the conflict, but the truth story, right?
Exactly.
Has been kind of banned and outlawed. Like we can't teach that true history.
I know.
And so in the combination of 400, 500, 600 years in some cases of being the beneficiaries, that's a joke, of slavery, meaning that I don't know who my great-grandparents are. Right?
Yes.
I have no connection to my music, to my ancestral religion, home, or anything. I'm completely detached. And so therefore, we as African Americans are always the other,
Oh, yes.
And so in closing on that, if you could talk a little bit about your upcoming work, The Denial of Experience.
Yes.
And I would like to invite you to look at my TED Talk called The Other, How Negative Images Affect Human Relationships Globally on YouTube. Thank you.
Perfect. Thank you. That's a very good question. And in a way, my being a professor here, I went to Princeton, and after that I went to Michigan, and I've been there since. And of course, I teach contemporary theory, sociology. And when you do that, you have to, of course, talk about diversity, lack thereof, and racism, critical race theory, gender, feminism. All of these at least focus on identities. If you sort of look at those lessons and take them back to Turkey, because this is all a part of a global system and the global color line, then it's very easy to see the exclusions there and here similarly. And that is exactly what hegemons and authoritarian states do not want you to see. And here what we have is, of course, a white settler society. If you think about ever since Trump and onwards, we Republicans are openly racist, and not only that, our legal system cannot hold them accountable because it's a legal system written by white people for white people. And as a consequence, our whole democracy now is in crisis because of that. How I learned that is, of course, I said Armenians are very similar to Native Americans because they're older here. I mean, and their, of course, destruction is much bigger, a much higher scale than is said to be. There is that aspect of it. And of course, there is the slavery and all of that, but it is very important for these states to keep these minorities separate from each other, because the moment you bring all these experiences together, and that's why I want Armenians and Kurds in this country to work together with the natives and African Americans, then what that points to, because the treatment of all are similar, then you realize your common enemy, which is that correction. I mean, and that is, I think, how we're going to get into democracies, to become aware of that. And of course, we're running the Du Boisian convening. I mean, it helps, of course, that I have among my students many African Americans, my graduate students, so that for us, objectivity does not mean only sticking to knowledge that is objective and neutral. Objectivity means to be able to be open to as many different meanings that are produced and many different experiences that are produced beyond the white knowledge. That's how I sort of approach American society as well. Thank you.
Thank you, Müge Hocam. I would like to interject a question of mine, if you don't mind.
Always, yes.
Despite Turkish betrayal of the promise that the Kurds are part of the founding, ethnicity, is it still not an option for Kurds to claim that founding status? And does that not make them different from Armenians in that regard? Should Kurds opt for the minority path, or should they also consider this possibility of reclaiming the Turkish state, which is theirs, which can become theirs, and it must become theirs, in my opinion. But, okay.
Together with all the others, sort of, democratic way. No, I totally, I mean, and that is, of course, I would say the trump card that Kurds can play that either. But if you think, I don't know how this talk is going to be on YouTube and listened to in Turkey, because in Turkey, I mean, they do not even consider this. Nobody, that was what was so interesting to me, talking about silences, how silences, in a way, reproduce these hegemonies, because I did not know about this reneging promise until I started looking into it here. I mean, I didn't know about the Armenian genocide, even though I told at the time I got the best education Turkey had to offer. And it wasn't, I mean, it was only when I came to the United States and met this one Armenian, who said, "Oh, you're from the Middle East?" I said, "Yes." And he says, "Well, I'm from there too. Where are you from?" I said, "I'm from Turkey." And he says, "Why did you kill my grandparents?" And I said, "What happened here?" I mean, I haven't killed anyone. I know nobody in my family has killed anyone either. But that is, the violence has become the language that the minorities are talking to each other, because of the language of violence that has become so important in authoritarian societies. And I think once that is gone, once you look at peace, I totally agree. They are a part of the founding element, but it was also very nice because some said, "Oh yes, Turks and Kurds, we're kardeşçe yaşam. We all lived here as brothers." And Armenians presumably will be in there too. So I think I don't think it should be one or the other. It's exactly both that enables them. That's why Kurds are the democratic element in Turkey. And that is why the deep state hates them so much, because they are going to lose their hegemony once we all come to power and destroy the deep state, hopefully.
Thank you, Hocam. I would like to, let's give an applause. Okay. Before we move on to the reception, which is right here at the gallery, I would like to invite up Mark Gavur. who in addition to his expertise in operations management, is a skilled musician and a student of the oud and cumbush tradition. So he is going to offer us a small performance, my friend. I hope you are still, ready for that. Okay, so please.
And this is in the name of Kurdish Armenian Brotherhood.
And
right?
after that, we will proceed to the.
I met Ahmet Dursun by accident outside of Rockefeller. I was playing for the women's choir. They were doing Muhabbet, and they wanted musicians that knew the song. And I play in the Middle Eastern Music Ensemble for the University of Chicago, amongst other things. And he told me about Müge's lecture here, and I said, how fantastic. I said, I would like to surprise her and play a few numbers to honor her, because she's a wonderful person, and she's always been wonderful to me. My son was at the University of Michigan, not a student of hers in any of her classes, but worked on one of your conferences and supported it, so he sends you his greetings as well. So, I was going to play oud, and then I figured Armenians and Kurds. The name Adam Tigran was ringing in my head. And, I wanted to play cumbush instead. I would probably have just wore a polo shirt, but Adam Tigran always played with a button-down shirt and tie, so I want to honor his tradition as well. And I want to play just a couple songs to give some flavor, and because the music shows the shared culture better than anything else, I think. And that's, I think, really important to keep in mind. We can look at differences easily, right? But similarities is what we should be striving for. And there are a lot of similarities. Probably, I will probably know every food that's served after this. And I hate to be the person who stands between food and music. So, Adam Tigran was born in Kamishli. His family was from Diyarbakir, which Armenians call Dikranagir for some reason. He was a next door neighbor to a good friend of mine. I've never met Adam Tigran, but he was a neighbor. My friend was a kid living next door to Adam Tigran. Adam Tigran took him under his wing, taught him all the songs of Diyarbakir, Armenian songs of Diyarbakir, in both Armenian and Kurdish. And then Varujan and I used to do concerts of these songs. I knew these songs because of Adam Tigran was not mainstream Armenian artist because he was more known, I think, amongst the Kurds. But I got to know him. He was born in 1934 and died August 8th, 2009. And I just want to share one quote from him. It says, "If I come to the world again, I will melt all the tanks, rifles, and weapons and make sazes, jumbushes, and zurnats." Now, I should be playing Ay Dilberi, but I only play that with other groups, and I've never really played it on my own. But I promise you that I'm going to learn it and learn to sing it in Kurdish as well. But the songs I want to play, are in Armenian Asmarakchi, but in Kurdish it's Yar Meleke. And then Ayla Luchas, in the Kurdish version, is Desmalamin. And the Ala Luchas and Desmalamin are, it's exactly the same song. The words are exactly the same. A girl has lost her handkerchief, and she accuses the boy next door, her potential love interest, of having taken a handkerchief and hidden it. And he's, "Oh, I haven't done such a thing." And it's a song like that. And then if we have time at the end, I will do a song a friend of mine wrote that he wrote the music, but Ahmet Kaya wrote the words. It's called Ala Dikja. If you know the words, I'm not going to sing, but I'm going to play. If you know the words, join in. Okay, so first we'll do the... I will play probably a little bit slower first, and then Armenians seem to play that more upbeat. And it's funny because if it's Kurdish and Armenian both together, the words in Armenian are almost in the Eastern dialect, which is kind of weird because it should be in the Western dialect. By the way, in case you, my family is from Elazığ. Several of the villages there, I can name all Armenian villages of Elazığ. My grandfather was from Kesidik, my grandmother was from Yerike and Mezire. And then I have one grandfather from Shevakari. Next song, Ara Dikshan originally wrote it as Picture. Ahmet Kaya wrote the words to it. It became Ala Dikja. And it's one of the most haunting songs I've ever listened to. Thank you very much. I don't want to take up any more time.
Okay, now we can proceed to the reception.